Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today, we are going to discuss John Searle's philosophy of mind. John Searle advocates biological naturalism. According to Searle, mind is a biological phenomenon and it is caused by the neurophysiological processes of the brain. Now, look at the hypothesis that Searle is talking about. The hypothesis says mental phenomena are caused by brain processes and realized in the brain processes. The Searlean hypothesis I have mentioned with reference to Cartesian dualism when we discussed about Cartesian dualism and Searle's criticism to the Cartesian dualism. Now, does Searle commit some kind of a dualism when he makes this distinction that brain is the cause of consciousness, the brain is the cause of mind, the mental phenomena are being caused by certain brain processes? Does Searle make this assumption that mind is an epiphenomenon, mind is not a reality as such? Does Searle's thesis suggest this? Now, from the hypothesis we will also have some kind of a implication, and that is Searle's notion of emergentism. Does Searle advocate emergentism when he says that mental is caused by brain processes or consciousness is caused by brain processes? Now, if such a theory can be discussed, I think we would have a separate discussion on Searle's concept of emergentism. But today I will basically focus on what is this biological naturalism, what are the theoretical backgrounds on which biological naturalism is argued by Searle, and what are the main concepts which Searle finds are important for our discussion on theory of mind. Because as we have seen in the history of naturalism, there are various theories have been advocated, particularly right from the mind brain identity theorists to functionalists, and more recently the kind of theory which was advocated by Dennett and Fodor. Now, Fodor and Dennett are the champions of the computational theory of mind. Now, if we take their naturalistic hypothesis into consideration, then probably we will find that the Searlean naturalism is little different. So, the question is, how does Searle's naturalism, particularly the biological naturalism, is different from other forms of naturalism? That is one question I think we need to analyze in this talk. Now, let us go to this hypothesis and try to understand why Searle is interested in biological naturalism, why Searle calls is biological, the consciousness is biological. Now, biological naturalism suggests that as we have a stomach digestion relationship, stomach is a particular organism which is significant. So, to explain the digestive system or the process of digestion. So, similarly, brain is a particular system which is very important, and that would explain how consciousness works. So, without brain, if we talk about consciousness, that sounds quite illogical for Searle, because so far as the neural science is concerned, neuroscience has proved that the brain is an important organism, and it is very vital and it is very significant for all of us to understand how this organism is functioning and causing consciousness. So, therefore, Searle gives this analogy to us that the digestive system is responsible for causing or processing food. Similarly, the brain is responsible for causing mental phenomena. So, that kind of things Searle is talking about. I mean, Searle also says that biology is specific to the study of life, as physics talks about matter. Physics tries to explain the nature of matter. Similar way, biology tries to explain the nature of life. So, Searle makes a very clear distinction between physical sciences, particularly the physics, and biology. According to him, biology must deal with life, and biology does deal with life. So, that kind of importance Searle gives to biology as the science of life. I mean, how he differs? He differs in this way. When we talk about other forms of naturalism or other naturalists who talk about the causal explanation of the consciousness, there is certainly a causal closure within which the other naturalism functions. So, Searle tries to differ a bit and look at life in a very specific way. Okay. Searle does not say that the human body is not constituted of certain material particles. He does talk about the notion of matter, but whenever he talks about consciousness and the emergence of consciousness or the evolution of consciousness, he talks about life, and biology is the science to deal with life. So, there are two important theoretical presuppositions in biological naturalism argued by Searle. One is the atomic theory of matter, and another is the evolutionary biology. When we talk about the atomic theory, he emphasizes that every material body is constituted of certain atomic particles, and so also the human bodies are constituted of certain micro elements of the matter, may it carbon or atom molecules, etcetera, etcetera. So, all these micro elements are causally constituted. So, that is one thing which Searle keeps in his background. The other one is about the evolutionary biology. Searle thinks that everything has evolved historically. So, human consciousness has evolved historically following the Darwinian theory of evolution. So, these are the two important points when one reads Searle's biological naturalism, that his naturalism is something does not exclusively emphasize on pure materialistic understanding of the matter or the life. Rather, he tries to look at life as an evolving phenomenon, and how this evolving phenomenon has got very significant properties, and those properties are irreducible to the biological or what you call the brain processes. So, why does Searle say that, and what kind of thesis, what kind of explanation, explanatory frameworks Searle advocates to explain us that consciousness, though caused by brain processes, are irreducible to brain processes. So, life as such is something very significant. Life as such as an evolutionary phenomenon is something very significant, because every evolutionary phenomenon for Searle has got some distinct properties, and these distinct properties are irreducible properties, so far as the lower level of properties are concerned. So, now we would look at Searle's thesis very closely. What kinds of explanatory frameworks Searle provides to justify his hypothesis, that is, consciousness is being caused by brain processes and realized in brain processes. Now, it is evident, so far as the naturalistic standpoint is concerned, that every philosopher of mind within the naturalistic framework argues that consciousness is caused by brain processes, and we have seen extensively when we dealt with the mind brain identity theory, particularly with reference to the place hypothesis. When one looks at this hypothesis, one may find that it is too simple, but it is not that simple. We need to also relate the first part with the second part, that is the realization conditions. It is not that the brain is only causing mental states or causing consciousness, but it also has a condition to hold on to these emerged mental states. So, that kind of hypothesis is very unique when we compare it with other philosophers of mind, those who talk about the naturalistic theory of mind. Now, the two aspects of this causal relationship is something very important to understand. One is the causal sufficiency, another is the causal interrelationship, and Searle calls it the principle of neurological sufficiency. Now, principle of neurological sufficiency suggests that X, if you say, let us say X is the brain and X is causing Y. The brain causes consciousness. This says the brain is neurologically sufficient to cause consciousness, but at the same time we also need to talk about what happens when consciousness is caused, what happens to those intentional states or mental states, what happens to them when they are caused. Because for Searle, I mean, when somebody reads his Intentionality, an essay in philosophy of mind published by Cambridge University Press in 1983, towards the end of the book, Searle proposes this hypothesis, but it is very clearly explained when one reads the book The Rediscovery of Mind, which is published by Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1992. This work suggests that brain causes intentional states. In intentionality, Searle argues that intentional mental states are caused by brain processes. Now, in the later work, that is in the rediscovery of mind, at the same time in Mind, Brains and Science, we will find that Searle is talking about that how brain consciousness is caused by brain processes. So, what he means by this, that whenever we talk about consciousness, we also see that these intentional states are conscious mental states. So, he uses intentional states as conscious mental states. There will be no intentional mental states which are unconscious mental states. In principle, they are conscious. Okay. So, now the brain has the mechanism to produce consciousness, and it has also the mechanism in the sense that it is causally sufficient to hold on those produced mental states, so that the mental states are realized. These mental states gets realized within the function of the brain. So, when you say brain is causing mind or brain is causing consciousness, then there is a kind of a bottom up causal relationship we find. Okay. And this kind of causal relationship is also argued by the emergentists. As I mentioned, when Searle says brain causing mind, Searle is committing to emergentism. That will be understood if we little explicate the hypothesis. Now, let us look at one of the statements of Searle from the rediscovery of mind. Brain not only produces, but also sustains the conscious life. The regenerating process in the brain reveals the realization of mental states in the brain processes. So, you have a kind of a level where brain is causing consciousness, and you have also a kind of a level where brain sustains those mental phenomena, and we have also a level when we talk about brain realizes this mental phenomena. So, there are at least two levels in which one can look at this principle of neural sufficiency working. The one level you have the living brain, okay, and the living brain with life is causing mental states or consciousness, and that would show some kind of a bottom up causal relationship. Okay. There is also a top down causal relationship, it is called top down. Top down in the sense that whenever a particular mental state, let us say M1, okay, is getting realized, then it also causally related to the brain. So, this kind of a realization, say for example, I am feeling thirsty. Now, if I quench my thirst with a glass of water, then obviously my desire is getting realized, in the sense that my desire is being satisfied with a glass of water. So, that satisfaction condition, okay, or the satisfaction which emerges from this process is showing a kind of a causal relationship, okay, that relationship coming from the mental states to the brain states. Okay. Now, when Searle talks about the realization of mental states, Searle also refers to this fact that there is no one to one realization, rather mental states constitute some kind of a system or a network, what he calls network. So, there is a network of mental states, or what he says, the network of intentional states. So, there are various kind of intentional states, and it is those intentional states which are causally responsible for the satisfaction of a particular mental state. When my desire is satisfied, my desire is linked with other mental states. It is not that only one mental state is getting satisfied, and it works in a one to one way. It is not that. There are network of mental states, and each one is connected with the other. That is what is becoming very significant in the framework of Searle, how a mental state is realized. So, that has to be kept in mind. I will come back to the notion of intentional state or the network of intentional states little later, when we will talk about intentionality. But let us assume that Searle is talking about two causal modalities. One is a kind of a bottom up causation, and another is a kind of a top down causations. This is for our understanding. Searle does not talk about bottom up and top down. This is typically a kind of an emergentist concept of concepts used by Kim and many others. I am using for our better understanding to clarify that this hypothesis has got two levels of causality operating together. They may be operating simultaneously, we do not know that, but theoretically if you try to explain their causal functions, we need to look at it in a very systematic way. This implication is very inevitable. Now, look at the implications which I would like to draw to your attention. On these definitions, consciousness is causally emergent property of the systems. It is an emergent feature of the certain systems of the neurons. In the same way, solidity and liquidity are emergent features of the system of molecules. According to Searle, you have two levels of explanations, and consciousness being an emerged phenomenon, you find that this is a kind of a level, say level 1, and you have another level called level 2. Now, this level is what is called a kind of a lattice structure. This is a lattice structure, where you have micro particles, you have micro particles only. Now, these micro constituents certainly cause something, that is it could be in the case of any liquid material, liquidity, or what I call solidity. Now, this table, particular table on which we are writing, is as kind of solid material object. The solidity is a product of the micro constituents that are together, they are causally bound together, and in order to produce this effect called solidity. We find that whenever I keep my hand, that the table will not fall. So, the table is so solid that it will be able to rest my arm, hold my arm. So, that kind of idea of solidity Searle is talking about. So, solidity as a what he calls as a macro level phenomenon is different from the micro level phenomenon, or what is there at the micro level, or what is there at the lattice structure of the brain. So, every phenomenon has got this idea, and according to Searle or according to any emergentist, they will also hold on to this kind of analysis. So, there is a physical structure, and this physical structure is responsible for causing mental network or the network of mental states, and network of mental states will causally influence the physical state. So, that kind of analysis is very much present in the emergentists, but this is I think one of the implications which immediately draws our attention when one reads Searle's biological naturalism, because this naturalism is advocated on the background of Darwin's evolutionary theory of biology. And as I said, when we talk about evolution, we cannot forget the hierarchies that we find in the natural things. You have animals, plants, insects, human beings, many beings with life. If life has evolved, then you certainly have to maintain this hierarchy very strongly, and Searle does maintain that hierarchy. Searle does say that human consciousness is something very specific to human life, it is different from animal life. So, that is very clear in Searle, but what is important here is this, that when we talk about evolutionary theory of mind, we need to also look at its implication. One of the implications is that it adheres to an emergentist thesis, or it is supportive of this emergentist thesis. So, that kind of thing one has to look at. Does Searle advocate emergentism? The answer here is no. Searle's thesis does not advocate emergentism. For an emergentist, what precisely is the case? That the mind is conceived as a whole constituted of various functions of the parts or the subsystems of the brain. Nevertheless, the emergence of the whole is qualitatively different from the constituted parts. That is very significant, because when we say they are qualitatively different, that is, at the level of the lattice structure, you have some kind of particles, microparticles, and these microparticles are causally related with one another, and their function is qualitatively different from the function of the mental states, which are also related with one another. Maybe they are causally related with one another, but what kind of causality Searle is interested in? We need to talk about that in order to explain that Searle's thesis is different from other naturalist thesis. But Searle at least holds on to this thesis that mind is a part of the biological reality. Mind is a part of the nature. It is not different from nature. Searle defines emergence in this way, that consciousness could cause things that could not be explained by the causal behavior of the neurons. The naive idea here is the consciousness gets squatted out by the behavior of the neurons in the brain, but once it has been squatted out, then has a life of its own. Now, this is something very interesting. Once consciousness is caused, let us say once you have consciousness, then you find that it has life of its own, meaning thereby it can do all its function. It is something very autonomous. It defines its own functions. So, that kind of life, because life is a very important concept when one reads Searle's biological naturalism. Now, he says once it is squatted out, it has its own life, meaning thereby it is independent of the brain processes. So, brain processes has no control, as if brain process has no control, but if one relates to the hypothesis, then one of course finds that brain is causing consciousness, and there is also kind of a causal influence happening when they are being realized. These two relationship processes going on all the time. So, but what is important is that no realization happens without the intervention of mind, and mind for Searle is constituted of the network of mental states. So, the whole network of mental states constitutes mind. So, what is mind? Mind is constituted of the entire intentional states, that is mind. And so, if we look at Searle's this definition, then we would like to conclude that it does not commit to the kind of emergentism which we would probably think in the case of emergentists like Keim, say for example. Keim is a critique of Searle biological naturalism. Now, Keim argues that if property M, that is mind, emerges from the properties n 1 to n n, then M supervenes on n 1, that is the brain. So, mind supervenes on the brain. So, that is to say, a system that are alike in the respect of the basal conditions must be alike in the respect of the emergent properties. So, the emergentist like Keim argues that the mind is very much caused by the brain. By talking about this causal relationship, he finds that mind supervenes. Mind is a supervening kind of a property, or consciousness is a kind of a supervening property. All these supervening properties are not causally sufficient to determine the relations with the physical, they are not causally sufficient. So, the physical of course causes mind, but mind only supervenes. I think we will have a exclusive discussion on Kim and Searle, okay, and other emergentists, but let us limit our discussion here with Kim's this definition, because this definition is quite analogous to the kind of thesis which Searle is advocating. But so far the Searle's thesis is concerned, Searle is not advocating emergentism, because Searle does not hold this thesis that mind supervenes on the physical or the mind supervenes on the brain. Rather, mind has certain unique properties, mind has certain specific properties, and these properties are irreducible properties. So, the irreducibility thesis which Searle holds is something very significant. Now, what are those properties which Searle considers are significant? One of those properties is intentionality. For Searle, consciousness is intentional. So, an intentional state is intrinsically intentional. Intentionality is a property of consciousness. So, Kim also talks about irreducibility. So, what is the difference between Kim and Searle? So, we will look at this notion of emergence in a separate class. What Searle argues when he talks about the two levels of explanations. One, as I said, the micro level of explanations, and another, as I said, it is a kind of a micro level of explanations. The micro level refers to the lattice structure of a particular thing, how a thing is constituted, and at the macro level we have a different kind of explanations, where how things behaves with reality. So, for example, what is a tree? You have tree has its micro elements, and tree as a being in the nature interacts with nature. So, that is that interaction, the tree as an organism interacts intentionally with nature according to Searle. Trees, animals, insects, all when they interact intentionality, they all possess intentionality, because consciousness is intentional. In principle, it is intentional, and all these when they interact with the universe as a living body, it shows that intentionality is explicitly present in their behaviors. So, Searle holds on to the thesis that intentionality is intrinsic to the living beings, the consciousness of the living beings, and for all living beings are conscious beings. If we have this theory, then when a living body interacts with the nature, that interaction will talk about a kind of a macro level explanation of the behavior of the particular body. When human interacts with the world, or when humans are interacting with other human beings or other physical living beings, and then this interaction is macro level interaction, and we need to give a macro level explanation to this interaction. But human beings as a living body is constituted of certain microparticles, and those microparticles are significant so far as my living is concerned, or the notion of living is concerned, the biological capacities of the body, power of the body. So, that will be that explanation will be about the micro level explanations. So, there are two levels of explanations, and so far as science is concerned, science only deals with the micro level explanations. When the scientific community claims that consciousness is caused by brain processes and human mind can be explained scientifically, they only refer to the micro level explanation. Okay. So, their emphasis is very clear, but we are not just human beings, constituted of certain material particles. We are much more than that. So, we are not just a lump of physical material body, but we also behave, in our social world. We have some values, we interact with others, our actions are rational. So, all this if you take into account, the social understanding of the being is something very different, something very unique, and Searle emphasizes this aspect, that we are more than the material stuff. We as a human being are social beings, and within a social form of life, we interact with the other beings in a much different way, that is qualitatively different from the kind of things which we find happening at the micro levels. So, this is Searle's emphasis on the notion of leveling. Now, what is consciousness? What does Searle mean by consciousness? As I mentioned earlier, so whenever he talks about the emergence of consciousness or consciousness is caused by brain processes, he refers to the conscious mental states. Now, all these mental states are in principle conscious, but some of them, as he says, some of them are intentional, not all are intentional, only a few are intentional. Only a few are intentional. So, intentionality becomes one of the properties of consciousness. So, also subjectivity and mental cognitions. When Searle says there are few mental states which are conscious, meaning thereby if I say I am conscious of what I am saying, I am conscious that I am talking to you. So, I am conscious of this fact that I am lecturing. Now, if that is the case, then I am only conscious of the few things what has been discussed in, say, in the theory of biological naturalism, but I am not conscious of many other things. So, that which I am not conscious of at present are though potentially conscious, but they are not intentional. Right now, they are unconscious mental states. So, Searle does talk about unconscious mental states. So, there are unconscious mental states. There are mental states which are unconscious, but those unconscious mental states are potentially conscious. So, they are potentially intentional. They do possess intentionality, they are potentially intentional, but the very fact that I am not conscious of them right now makes this case very clear that there are some unconscious mental states and there are some conscious mental states. So, there is a hierarchy of mental states. Searle would talk about hierarchy of mental states. Say for example, dream is one kind of a conscious state which is distinctly different from when I am awake. So, for example, when I am working or I am talking to you will be. So, consciousness with a lower intensity if somebody is in coma, if somebody talks about children who are say or infants. So, for example, infants are not full fledgedly conscious as we are. Animals, okay, insects. Now, all these have lesser power. So, far the conscious capacity is concerned, but the Searle's notion of consciousness is certainly not circular as we find in the case of Descartes. Now, Searle tries to give a scientific account of consciousness, hence he wants to make a non-circular explanation of consciousness. That is very clear in Searle. By non-circular, he means that this hypothesis is based on certain scientific assumptions, okay. And these assumptions or presuppositions are very logical to explain how consciousness is